Recording in progress.
But don't chase it there. First, I think Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, everyone, we're going to begin. And let me introduce President Robin Garrell of the Graduate Center, who's going to kick us off. Robin, please join us.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Garrell, president of the CUNY Graduate Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today, online and in person, for the briefing on the 2023 Communities of Interest Report. This is produced by our Center for Urban Research at the request of the New York City Districting Commission. I want to give a special welcome to Districting Commissioner Executive Director John Plateau, the staff representatives of the commission, and the CUNY faculty co-authors of the report who are with us today. In addition to John, they are Professor Zulema Blair of Medgar Evers and Professor Kina Lipsitz of the Graduate Center at Queens College. The other two co-authors, Professor Tara Hum of the Graduate Center in Queens College and Professor Viviana Rivera Burgos of Baruch College, were not able to join us today. I also want to acknowledge our own Stephen Romaluski, who contributed the maps, which you've had a chance to begin looking at. The Graduate Center is the only public research-intensive doctoral granting institution in New York City. Generating research that advances the public good is core to our mission. The Center for Urban Research, led by John Mollenkopf, is one of our more than 30 research centers and institutes that produces public-facing scholarship. The report that you'll hear about today is just one example of how the Graduate Center serves our city and is a great example of a project in which social scientists from across CUNY are working together to address key local and regional issues, as well as statewide issues. Our scholars have analyzed the changing demographics of New York and provided important insights into what the population trends mean for fair representation in city government. And I'm sure that we all agree that sustaining a fair and representative government is vital to the future of New York and for the strength of democracy as a whole. We're fortunate that John Plateau is a staunch advocate for fair representation. In addition to leading the Districting Commission, he is also a professor at Medgar Evers College and a Graduate Center alum, having earned his PhD in political science, working, as I understand it, with John Mollenkopf. So you're part of our legacy. It's with great pleasure that I invite him to the podium to say a few words. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam President. I just attended a a program here last Thursday evening. It was a filming of Rosa Parks. And two of the producers are also CUNY faculty. And they mentioned starting off, actually before diving into their commentary, about CUNY love. So I'm a CUNY baby, CUNY grown up, a number of degrees from City University of New York, a number of brothers and sisters who have gone this pathway. And right now I have the honor of teaching at Medgar Evers College, and my department chair, one of my chairs is here, and my dissertation advisor and doctoral advisor that shepherded me along the way here. And I just want to acknowledge that. John Mollenkoff, who's a distinguished professor, I think about threefold the last time I looked at his bio and all of his research and books and collaborative work. So this grows out of a vision that we could bring together a diverse team of CUNY scholars, and we've actually accomplished that goal from 4 or 5 different institutions throughout CUNY that have come together to produce this work. I would also, in closing, just want to acknowledge some of our, I think I see my commissioners here. Commissioner Collado, please wave. Are there any commissioners of our district commission here as well? At least Commissioner Collado there from the Bronx. And our key staffers. I should say that I was loaned out by CUNY to the Districting Commission on behalf of a request by the mayor and the speaker and our commissioners. Without their co-signing, I would have not spent 12 months at the commission, but I'm now back where I came from. I'm now back in the classroom at Medgar, and have the honor also to teach in our political science department right here at the grad center. So I am no longer the ED, so I do want to introduce behind a couple of these masks here, Grace Pyon, please stand and wave. Grace says, I pass the baton. Grace has been our general counsel and is also our executive director acting at the Districting Commission. And also Latoya Benjamin, our deputy chief of staff, is here. Akram Jabaran, he's somewhere in the room. And I saw our former communications director who is here as well. So I would just like to pass the baton on to our distinguished Dr. John Mollenkoff, and he will carry us forward in this program. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's in the report, some of the highlights. And I hope you have all gone to the website that was indicated in the press release materials so that you can download it and read it carefully, ponder the maps, ponder the points that are being made. But I'll just try to hit the highlights now, and I'll be followed by Dr. Blair and Dr. Lipsitz, who will talk respectively about the evolving Black communities and the emerging communities in the city of New York. And then I'll come back and wrap it up, and then we'll take whatever questions you may have. I'm not sure why the page down is not working for me. Up there. The evolution of communities in New York is rarely extremely rapid, but it's always very steady, and it's like the dripping of a river through a rock barrier over time. It can create a big chasm like the Grand Canyon. And we're in a period, especially since 1980, and particularly in this new millennium of the 21st century, where quite a bit of change is going on. All of the old mainstay ethnic groups that we think of as characteristic of New York as of, say, the 60s, Jews, Italians, Irish, on the white ethnic groups, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, all of those older groups are evolving and evolving away from the city. Their populations are diminishing, they're aging, they may be moving to the suburbs or to warmer climates in Florida or other parts of the country. And if it weren't for immigration, the city as a whole would be shrinking over recent decades. But immigration has restored the city, revitalized it in many different ways. And it's introduced new immigrant origin ethnic groups within all of the basic racial categorizations that we typically use: white, Black, Latino, and Asian, and some of the other racial classifications as well. And so the nature of what it means to be white or Black or Latino or Asian has been changing quite substantially. And our thinking, our social science research hasn't always caught up with that. The Districting Commission embraced the challenges of trying to understand the communities and craft a districting scheme that represented them well. But in the next decade, these changes will continue, and the Districting Commission of 2033, as well as the 2030 census, will be upon us faster than we realize. We've just gone through a long period of finding out what the new statistics are and reconceptualizing our ideas of community in the city. But that's not a task that is finished, that we can just forget about for 10 years. We should be spending the next 10 years focusing on what are the cutting edges of community development and evolution in the city. So we're going to begin with the communities of African descent that Professor Zulema Blair will tell us about. Welcome, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Mollenkoff, for spearheading this project and for really putting a lot of work and guidance into this. And thank you, Dr. Flateau, for commissioning, for lack of a better word, right? No pun intended, for commissioning this study, and my colleagues that worked with us here, Dr. Lipsitz and our colleague from New York Law School. So I want to point out that a couple of articles have already been written about a decline in the African-American population, or I should say in the Black community or people of African descent for the last 3 weeks. Both the New York Times and the Gotham Gazette did a couple of articles and a couple of pieces on it. But one of the things that I want to point out is most of the time people miss the mark on who are people of African descent. And so that was very important to this study. And it's also important as we look towards 2030 in counting our population and making sure that we have fair representation And so people of African descent consist of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latino, continental Africans, and individuals from Southeast Asia, Afro-Southeast Asian, notably a lot of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis self-identify with being Black. It is important that all of these subpopulations and groups are noted when we're speaking. Otherwise, we miss the mark on who is really leaving New York City and who are remaining. And so when you look at the African-American community, those are the real contrasts that we have to point out. People of African descent who were born in New York City actually want to stay in New York City. People of African descent who were born outside of New York, mostly from the South, just like there was a great migration to New York in the early 1900s, now we're seeing that exodus at the same rapid speed going forward. And so what we see is that 15% of individuals who are from the South, those individuals are contributing to the exodus of people of African descent, not necessarily people who have migrated from foreign countries such as Ghana, et cetera. Continental Africans, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Asians, they are coming in large numbers to New York City and are growing families here, going to school here, and remaining here. People of African descent who are here, what we notice is that those who are under 18, that's where you see the decline in population. Those are just families who are deciding not to have children or raise their children in New York State. However, individuals who are between the ages of 18 and 64, they have been increasing in New York City. And so we need to point that out as we go forward. Some of the things that we notice is that African Americans and all around people of African descent, their educational attainment is increasing, but their income is not increasing, it's stagnating. In fact, they're the lowest groups in terms of income increase or income percentage change throughout the last decade. And so that is a big issue for individuals needing to thrive here in New York City and remain in New York City, especially when it's not keeping pace with the cost of living factors. When you see rapid rents rise and decline in home ownership, you have to wonder what else can be done to ensure that African Americans or people of African descent get their fair share here. A distant second for people who are leaving New York are Afro-Caribbeans, as we know, people moving southward or people moving towards Florida. That's what you see for people who are Afro-Caribbean. But as I pointed out before, Afro-Latino, Afro-Asian, overall, they're coming in large numbers to the US and they're staying. In fact, what we see is an aging Black population. That number has doubled 100% for all people of African descent. So it's not that people of African descent overall are leaving New York City. When you look at it at a more micro level, you have to look at where they're from. The culture is different. What's happening with American descendants of slavery? Why aren't their incomes increasing? What is happening as we change our immigration policies, and how do we educate future individuals of African descent to continue to self-identify with Black as we move towards a 2030 count? Thank you.
So I'm going to briefly review what Viviana and Tari might have said, were they able to be here, both faced family care emergencies today, and unfortunately, they're not able to be with us. But they would say very similar things about the Latino and Asian communities of New York City, in the sense that they're growing, they're diversifying, they're creating new neighborhoods, and overall, they're advancing in terms of educational attainment, income, home ownership, and so forth. It's the Puerto Rican population, which once accounted for the vast majority of Spanish-speaking communities in New York City, has been diminishing, while immigrant origin groups like Dominicans and Mexicans, but also more recently from Central America, from places like Nicaragua and Venezuela, where there have been turmoil generating asylum seekers. New York City is getting more and more of those individuals arriving, and they come into difficult circumstances, not being citizens, perhaps not fully speaking English, some undocumented, but all communities have been advancing, and that's the good news. That's, if you look at the data over time, and especially in the last 10 years, you see very clear signs of advancement across the board. And you can see from this map that there are many parts of the city where the Latino populations are growing and forming communities, whether it's Sunset Park or the Dominican population growing in the western part of the lower part of the Bronx, and of course Queens being the capital of immigrant communities in New York City. Similarly, with the Asian communities, there's really no sector of the Asian population that is declining. We don't have old Asian immigrant groups, and even the Chinese, who have always been prominent in the Asian population in New York City, that population of Chinese origin has been growing very rapidly. And as Terry would have told us, the Asian population growth accounts for more than half of all of the population growth that's taken place in the city over the last decade. And again, you can see the different concentrations of different Asian groups, but I can't resist a slight tangent here in a personal anecdote. When I moved to New York City in 1980 from the Bay Area, and I was very concerned that living in the Bay Area, there was a tremendous amount of fantastic Mexican and Chinese restaurants and places to buy all the ingredients to make those cuisines. And then I thought, uh-oh, I'm moving to New York. I'm going to be bereft. There'll be no Mexican restaurants, no Chinese. Well, of course, New York has always had Chinese restaurants, but not really authentic ones. I'm sure I'm getting in trouble for saying that about 1980, but, and then I went to Sunset Park in about 1981, and I ate in the first Chinese restaurant to open up on 8th Avenue in Sunset Park. And lo and behold, 40 years later, it's an unbelievably thriving Chinese community. So just in that short period of time, we've seen what the rise of these communities can do in terms of neighborhood patterns. Now I'll turn it over to Kina Lipsitz, our colleague from Queens College and the Graduate Center, who will talk about some emerging communities in New York City that haven't been so much on the radar screens, the really big groups, for example, like Dominicans, and she will tell us about them.
Thanks and good afternoon. First, I want to do what all my other colleagues have done and thank John Mollenkopf for spearheading this effort and Dr. Flateau for having faith in the ability of my colleagues at CUNY to carry this off. I also want to thank the staff at the New York City Districting Commission who work with me, like Grace Pyun and Jabran Akram. Also, a huge shout out to Steve Romalewski, who made all the beautiful maps. And finally, I want to thank my students here at the Graduate Center, one of which I think is here, Carmel, and at Queens College, who come from these communities and have inspired this West Coast transplant every day with their stories. So this report was written in the spirit of looking forward to 2030. And in that spirit, I was tasked with identifying and describing communities that are emerging in New York City. These are the communities to watch, the ones that are revitalizing and energizing the city and are likely to make their presence felt in the years to come, not only in the next round of redistricting, but more generally as sites of political power. In addition, I considered an additional emerging community based on religious identification, New York's Muslim community, which is growing and also includes many of the emerging communities that I'll be discussing. So I defined an emerging community as one that had a population of less than 100,000 in 2010 and grew by more than 10% over the last decade. This definition led me to focus in the report on Bangladeshis, Nigerians, Guatemalans, Ghanaians, Uzbeks, and Egyptians. I've arranged them in the table, moving from the largest to the smallest, from left to right. So as you can see, Bangladeshis comprise the largest emerging community in New York City with a population of 114,000, and they've grown by nearly 50% over the last decade. Other emerging communities are usually somewhere in between 30 and 40,000 persons. For example, Egyptians were the smallest group I considered at 29,000, and both Nigerians and Guatemalans were closer to 40,000. Now, some of these communities are quite young. For example, between a quarter and a third of the Bangladeshi and Egyptian populations are under 18. It's interesting to notice, however, that a higher percentage of Egyptians are citizens of voting age, 74% versus 63% for Bangladeshis. This means that there's considerably more potential for growth in the number of voting Bangladeshis, even aside from their higher numbers. And finally, I want to say something about the decline in the citizen voting age population for Uzbeks. It's due to them having more children over the last decade. They've been having lots of children. And you can see that they experienced the largest growth in the population of children of any of these communities. And so again, what this means is they will become, by 2030, a lot of these children will become voters. And finally here, I wanted to just point to median household income as to give you a sense of how each of these communities is doing. So the median household income in New York City is around 71,000. You can see that some of these communities are doing much better than other communities. What's interesting is the community with the largest potential for growth in voters is also one of the worst off, the Bangladeshis. So this is explained in part by the fact that only 38% of Bangladeshi women work outside the home. This number is increasing, however, so it's likely that this community will be gaining economic power as it gains political power over the next decade. Okay, I did have a map of Muslims, and so I'll just say something about, oh, it's the next one? Oh, you put in, sorry. That's right. So what I wanted to say here with the map about the Bangladeshi population is that when you look at these emerging communities and you're trying to think about which ones are going to have an easier time with mobilizing and gaining representation, the ones that are more clustered are going to be the ones that have an easier time. And so here what you see is the Bangladeshi population, and you can see that they're fairly well clustered in certain areas of the city. Particularly in Queens, you have the clusters around Jamaica and Woodside and Jackson Heights, and then you go up to the Bronx, Soundview, there's another community there, and then you have a community in Brooklyn, in Kensington. So if you look at other communities, for example, the Nigerian community is very spread out throughout all of New York City. And so when it comes to actually mobilizing, advocating for themselves, it's going to be more of a challenge. And this suggests that the Bangladeshis are going to have a much easier time. And all of these maps you can see are in our report. So you can look at all of the different emerging communities and get a sense of which ones are more clustered. So finally, I just want to say a word about Muslims in New York City. So it's difficult to estimate the size of the Muslim population because the census doesn't ask anything about religious identification. There are a variety of ways to estimate this population based on the ancestries with which people identify, the countries they were born in, which gives you, those two together give you kind of an upper bound. You can also ask about the number of mosques in the city and estimate an average size of people who attend the Friday prayer, for instance, and that gives you a lower number. So if you use these two methods, which I go into in the report, you get somewhere between 115,000 and 450,000 Muslims in the city. So that's a big band. And unfortunately, that's the best we can do without a well-designed representative survey of New Yorkers, which would be fabulous if we could get somebody to do that or get the money to do that. Even if we're not certain about the number of Muslims in the city, we have a fairly good idea of where they live based on where people of particular ancestries live in the city. The largest ancestries contributing to the Muslim population in the city are Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Uzbeks, Egyptians, Albanians, and Yemenis. The map indicates that there are a fairly distinct cluster of Muslims living in the Bronx, or distinct clusters of Muslims living in the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn, with many scattered throughout Staten Island. The most concentrated number of Muslims are in Jamaica and Hollis, Queens, where large numbers of South Asians reside, as well as South Brooklyn, where South Asians are joined by Middle Eastern and North African groups such as Egyptians and Yemeni. And additional clusters can be found in the Bronx to the people of Albani, Yemeni, and Bangladeshi ancestry living there. And then again, there are some more around Jackson Heights, where South Asians reside. So if Muslims can overcome their cultural and linguistic differences, they are another emerging community that is likely to make its presence felt in the decade ahead. Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to come up and say a few words about what you found? Jeff Weiss is special counsel to the Districting Commission. And one of the interesting things about this effort is that you would think there might be a concise legal definition of what a community of interest is, since courts have often said that it's important and it's in our city charter as something we want to preserve when we're districting. But look as you might, you won't find a really precise answer. And Jeff has given us a scan of the whole legal environment that is, in my mind, the best thing on the topic we have out there. So thanks, Jeff.
I guess it's good morning. Good afternoon. I'll take a few minutes just to give you a sense of where the courts are, where communities of interest are in terms of communities of interest. And we have basic criteria: population equality, minority voting rights, compactness, contiguity, maintaining core districts, incumbency. But the fastest growing criteria in the last decade has been the use of communities of interest. And in fact, in the last few years, 2 free software programs have been developed to enable the public at no cost to work with very simple software to identify what their community of interest is and to submit it to their redistricting body, be it a legislature, commission, local government, what have you. But interestingly, the courts have really not provided any guidance as to what a community of interest is. We look at a community of interest as having common interests, whether it be socioeconomic, religious, academic, educational, medical, you name it, and they're often either subjective or objective, depending on where you're coming from, what you're looking at. But the courts have really not put a definition on it. Courts have said that communities of interest can be considered, that it's important that you identify communities of interest during the actual line drawing process. It's also important to be cognizant of the use of race in redistricting and communities of interest. Not to get into the Voting Rights Act issues, but it's perfectly reasonable to create a district that has a community of interest of like-minded or similar racial or ethnic groups, as long as you don't get into other factors that aren't the topic of today's conversation. But what have the courts really said? Courts have accepted to say, in approving this plan, we think that communities of interest were kept together. And that happened earliest in California, when special masters drew California's maps in the 1970s and said, we tried to keep communities of interest intact. The court said, you did a good job. Similarly, in the opposite in Texas in the 1990s, Texas tried to argue, we kept communities of interest together, but the court said, no, you didn't. So they really vary, but the one thing I found is that no court has ever invalidated a plan for the failure to maintain, keep, or create a community of interest. And just to give you an example, in closing, what the courts here have said in New York, and this is all in the appendix to the report. In the 1990s, during a challenge to New York's congressional plan, the courts held that Hispanic voters in different parts of New York City were not cohesive, especially when you were joining parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Brooklyn together into one district. So like other areas of redistricting law, this is an evolving area. We've seen in the last few years, really in the last 3 or 4 years, how something called ensemble analyses have been developed by social scientists and mathematicians to gauge compactness, communities, compactness, minority concerns, partisan gerrymandering. And my sense is, we're only in 2023 now, but by 2030, people like Professors Lipsitz and Professor Blair and others will begin applying metrics to what a community of interest is, so the courts can have something to really weigh objectively what they're looking at and give the public a much better chance to define what a community of interest is when line drawing takes place in the next round. So thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up and we'll turn to questions in a second. I also want to thank the Districting Commission staff, John, Grace, Jabran, Eddie Boris, for all of the help and support and guidance they've given us in launching this effort. Of course, my colleagues from CUNY did a fantastic job, and we're a big sprawling university with many parts. Sometimes people in one department don't even talk to the person in the next department here in this building. And this has been a wonderful effort to reach across the university and bring together people who have common research interests to share ideas, to explore the city. And of course, with hundreds of thousands of students within CUNY coming from all of these communities, as Keena says, we work every day with very gifted young people who are coming out of these communities and who will shape the future of New York City, will be the future of New York City. So the chance to work together across these institutional boundaries has been great. And I would just conclude by saying, as you've seen from these presentations, there's a tremendous amount of interesting change going on, often below the radar, often below the broad categories of African Americans are doing this, or Asians are doing that. Asian is a particularly problematic term for me because people who are classified as Asians come from so many different parts of the world, speak so many different languages, have so many different religions and cultures and so forth. I think you lose as much as you gain by saying they're all fit in one box. So it's time for the city and for the City University of New York to be more focused and more deliberate about following the trajectories of all the communities that are evolving in New York City. And one recommendation we have is that and I guess this is expected of professors and social scientists to say, we need more data, we need better data. But as Keena pointed out, the census gives us a lot of very rich data, which we've used in this study, but there are many important things that it doesn't ask about. Religion being one obvious example. You could also add civic engagement. That's, do people vote? Do they participate in community organizations? There are many questions that we're very interested in knowing about. The quality of neighborhood life, the quality of family life, whether people like their city services, what problems they think they're facing in their neighborhood. There's a whole vast range of questions that we should be able to answer systematically with better data sources than we have. And we can't answer them at the moment. So one plea we would leave with those who think about the report and make decisions within the city is, how can we focus our resources best to systematically understand what's going on in the city? I'll leave you with that. Please download the report, cruise through the maps, and maybe you can flip through from one to the other and see how the various patterns overlap with each other or are distinct from each other. Again, thanks to Steve and Valerie and the team at the CUNY Mapping Service, who have done such an excellent job on many projects to help visualize the change that's going on through their mapping. So at this point, I'm happy to take any questions. You can address them to me or any of the other speakers. If you have questions for the parts of the report done by Viviana or by Terry, you can find their email addresses easily, and I'm sure that they would be happy to respond to you if you send them a query. So the floor is open to questions that any of you might have. Yes, and I'm thinking, I don't want to just jump in with an answer, but in one of the first tables in the report, it shows both the changes in the overall population and the changes in the voting age citizenry. And New York City became a city in which non-Hispanic whites were not the majority of the population somewhere in the latter 1980s, and where non-Hispanic whites were a minority of the voting age citizens sometime in the 1990s. So for quite some time, for decades, we've been a city in which if white voting populations coalesce around one candidate, they could win in the past, but they can no longer do that. So the name of the game really is, how do you fashion cross-racial coalitions in New York City? It's not only desirable, it's necessary if you're going to forge a coalition and to win a majority in election and a majority in a governing coalition. So a lot of these groups, again, Keena pointed out one particular example with the Bangladeshis. A group will come in, largely non-citizens. The foreign-born will be relatively older. Their children aren't old enough yet who are born here in the US are not old enough to vote. So the process by which a group becomes voting age citizens is something that takes time. It takes across generations sometimes, and it also takes a lot of education. Hopefully the K-12 school system and CUNY do a good job in civic education so people understand the importance of elections and who represents them and the redistricting process. But over time, the city will be shaped by immigrants who have become citizens and their children. For example, more than half of the Black electorate in New York City is either immigrant or the child of an immigrant. And of course, for the Asian populations, that's more like 80% or so. So we need to watch not only how the communities are changing in terms of their overall size and their level of education, their incomes, home ownership, all of that, but also how they're becoming civically engaged. And the Center for Urban Research here at the Graduate Center is is really going to be focused on that in the next decade in order to sort of trace the civic and political progress of all the different groups. I don't know if I precisely answered your question. If you have a follow-up, I'd be happy. Yes, Zulima.
But I think also Jack and John would jump in here. So it also depends as well on how our communities are interested. We both know that these are very important people going forward. They identify us, and when we were drawing in say 45th Council District in this area, we saw that we can have time. They identify with this council district and with this community, et cetera. And so that's why we were pointing out. You can't just say this group is belonging to this group or that group. Who they identify as, for example, black? Could we still only say non-Hispanic? Because then the numbers would. But if you include the multiracial factor, which at this point is at least 6%, 7%, you'll get more majority black districts in the country.
Yes.
Are you thinking about looking at communal infrastructure? That these groups need a mature, I don't know, need, but their interests are facilitated if there are mature communal infrastructures, building, allowing them to transform their numbers into cloud. The Bangladeshi, as you mentioned, have a pretty decent communal infrastructure, and they've built very strong coalitions, both with other South Asian groups and beyond. Whereas I haven't seen it with Egyptian groups, as an example.
I think you've just identified an excellent research agenda for the seminars that John and Zulima and Kina and I will be teaching over the next decade. Yes, clearly it's very important what the collective capacity of these communities is and how it's developing and what the makeup of, we know that the church congregations are essential to the political organization of communities of people of African descent. But that's not, if only the census asked, what groups do you belong to? But we don't have any survey. I mean, I've done some surveys where we've asked these questions, but we don't systematically know how to answer these questions. We're doing things like taking all the contracts that the city and state government have let to nonprofit organizations that are immigrant serving, and to develop a database of where these organizations are and what their budgets are and how they're evolving. But we don't actually know what the geographies are that they serve, because the city's data collection mechanism around contracting, it'll tell you where the person that's signing the MOUs is located, but it doesn't necessarily tell you where the service points are. So there's just so much. I mean, we have $100 billion government, and probably, just as a wild guess, maybe a third of that is going out through contracts to non-governmental entities to deliver services. So who they are, where they are, what they're doing is extremely important to the fabric of the city. But all we know about it is really for accounting purposes and accountability purposes, and not really about understanding service patterns or the needs of the clients. City government has been struggling to get its systems to talk to each other, so that somebody who, let's say a family is involved with the Agency for Children's Services, Department of Social Services, the Police Department, the Health and Hospitals Corporation. It's the same household and family and children perhaps, but there are like 20 different files for city government. And if you see one file, you don't necessarily know what's in the other file. So city government itself has been trying to overcome those barriers with some very interesting efforts. I personally would like to have a large-scale survey from bottom up so that we could ask a family which agencies it's involved with and whether those agencies work at cross purposes or the effects of the different agencies reinforce each other. That's not a question also that we can answer at this point. But, you know, I mean, New York City is a fantastic laboratory for exploring all these difficult questions that every major city in the world is facing. So that makes it a great place for all of us social scientists and researchers to practice our craft. But thank you for the question. It's a good one. Yes, Carmel.
Emerging communities, see that Nigerians are the highest earners. So can you talk more about the income change and why it's happening? Why it's not involved in
So the five subgroups, African Americans who are born in New York, they have the slowest rate of income. Specifically, their median income only went from 60,000 in 2010 to about 66,000 roughly. So only about 500 over that decade. It's a little bit higher for people who are born outside of New York. But when you look at
So Lima, would you mind coming up here because we lose it from the Zoom feed if you're just talking to them. So thank you, and you know also.
But if you look at the Afro-Southeast Asian community, particularly the Bangladeshis and then the Pakistanis, their income is on a rapid rise. So is the continental Africans, the Nigerians. And I would say the Afro-Caribbean, they continue to rise. Their median income is roughly 80,000, similarly for the continental Africans. And although the Afro-Latino have a lower income scale, they're on like a 30% increase over the last decade. So the other groups, the Afro-Latinos, the continental Africans and Afro-Southeast Asians, they're increasing. The African Americans who were born in New York, however, is not, or is stagnating. And then so you see the other issues that spur out of control as a result, the home ownership, the rent, the rise in the group quarters and things of that nature, even though they have a higher educational attainment from previous decades.
I'll just add something about Nigerians relative to other types of African Americans or people born here. Nigerians tend to be, on the whole, they have a higher rate of getting a BA, a college degree. And then also, you see that all of these communities specialize in certain areas, and the Nigerians have really gravitated towards healthcare industry, particularly nursing, which pays quite well. And so I think that's another thing that accounts for the difference.
I mean, we are seeing the legacy of racial discrimination in how different groups of people of African descent are going through the life cycle and climbing the earnings ladder and having access or not to occupations that provide higher incomes. And you know, every part of our educational system, whether it's K-12 or CUNY, needs to do a better job in fostering upward mobility for African Americans. I mean, that seems like an obvious conclusion from the numbers. Immigrant groups, even immigrant groups of African descent, come into the city in far different ways. Part of the reason that Nigerians have a high level of income is that to get a visa to move to the United States is a very severe selective process, and people with very high levels of education are much more likely to be able to move here. And a lot of Nigerians coming to New York City are highly educated and have access to professional jobs that pay very well. And they don't have the legacy of having grown up in the projects and witnessed the crack epidemic when they were little kids, and other things that are really hampering of upward mobility in the city. So even though our report says the groups are all moving upward on average or for the median, there's a lot of distribution across the groups, and there's a huge amount of inequality in the city, and a lot of it is systematic, and we have to make sure we find ways for all groups to overcome the barriers to doing better year by year. And I think education in CUNY is absolutely a key part of that. We do a good job, I think, but we could do a better job than we currently do. Yes.
Considering someone now white as black versus in other parts of the community where the South Asian community is more concentrated and we consider ourselves as South Asian.
Yes, so just knowing the data, we do know that an increase in the Kensington area, there is an increase of Bangladeshis there that do identify as Black. However, when you're looking at the census, ACS in particular, or even the decennial census, it's what they identify with. And when you look at qualitative reports from their testimonies with the Districting Commission, et cetera, and coming out, they actually identify as being I am Black. However, I am also Asian. And so they want that double identification to acknowledge that they have migrated here, but they also recognize this racial difference. So I see it more in Brooklyn with Kensington. In Queens, what I would point out, a good majority of the Guyanese population in Queens will say that they are both Indian, Asian, and Black.
Could I just say a word about this too?
Mm-hmm.
The census has been changing the way that it asks the race question over decades, and it's going to continue to do so into the next censuses. And they're really making it easier and they're encouraging people to express all their different racial and ethnic identities. So a dark-skinned person from Bangladesh who lives in a neighborhood nearby Black people and African-American communities, and who may be seen by the less knowledgeable larger society as, oh, that person looks like they might be Black. Or in Guyana, somebody growing up as Indian, it's very much a biracial situation in Guyana, or Indian ancestry and African ancestry, where the culture has been mixed. I think the census is trying to make it easier for people to say, yes, I'm not just simply fit in one single box. I can check off a bunch of different boxes that might represent different parts of me or realities of myself. So we're seeing a blurring of the old categories, and not just in individual choices and definitions, but also in terms of how people live nearby or next to each other. But your question of at what rate do the Asians also say they're Black across different neighborhoods is not one that we've specifically looked at, but if you give me your email address later this afternoon, I'll go run the numbers and tell you what the percentages are across different community districts in New York City. It's an interesting question. And I think racial identity is becoming more malleable and the boundaries more blurry and people accepting of more ambiguity rather than sort of an old one-drop rule. If you're just a little bit that, you're that and only that. Things are changing. Yes. Absolutely. There are a lot of the immigrant groups did not grow up in societies where they were used to American racial categories, and they get here and people want to put them in the pigeonhole, but they don't recognize that classification system as something that really speaks to who they are. I agree. Yes. Okay.
The second question was, President Armstrong, you're speaking, about diversity and similarly with African, there is always differences.
Yes.
Differences. But at the same time, there are things that unite the different ethnicities together. And in broader categories like immigration, status, and language accent issues, hate crime, etc. So as we move to 2030, do you see the broader categories, what role do you see the broader categories playing in analyzing?
That's a great question, and I'm long overdue in completing a book that tries to answer it, and it would probably take a book length response to fully address the points you raise. Just a couple of things. Hispanic origin, Latino, what Latinx, whatever term you want to use, certainly there's a shared language. Often there's somewhat shared religious backgrounds. There's a shared history of Spanish colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. So there are definitely things that are potentially basis of unity, along with the objective situation of being relatively poor, other than Puerto Ricans not arriving as citizens, language issues, workplace issues, accessing the education system, having it respond to. So there are definitely a lot of both common cultural and sort of objective group shared interests, but there's also, immigration is often people from a particular city or even village or neighborhood leaving and then clustering in a certain neighborhood of New York City. And so you can detect differences in accent or difference in dialect in speaking Spanish. So somebody from the Dominican Republic may know just from listening to somebody from Nicaragua that they speak a different flavor of Spanish, if you will. So the whole question of which will dominate as the communities mobilize, what they have in common or what they have that makes them different, depends, I think, to a certain degree on how the people that want to mobilize that community civically and politically interpret that. Do they think that it's better to build a really ethnic, specialized, very group-oriented approach, or do you want to, or shall we build on what cuts across? And I think there are groups that do both. There are lots of hometown associations from in Latino immigrant groups and Asian and I mean West Indian communities have rotating credit societies, and you know, there's the ex-constable league of people who were in the police department in Jamaica. There are a lot of peculiarities, but those also can be building blocks for building beyond those barriers, building horizontal coalitions of lots of different elements. And it's the latter that I think comes through you know, political leaders with vision who want to bring communities together. It's certainly in the interest of the political parties and political candidates to build broad coalitions. So, you know, exactly how that works out, I think, will be, you know, division is the handmaiden to an old establishment, preventing newcomers from challenging it. So there are probably people who would like to make sure everybody's too fragmented to get together to give them a hard time too. So, and how that works out, I think it will be the content of the political history of New York City in the next decade. You probably.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that has been said a number of times there. Really comes down to geography a lot of the times, where people, when they come, where they migrate to, or what are the historic neighborhoods. You take the Northern Bronx, big Caribbean community, big continental African community. You take Central Brooklyn, it still has, even if it has been gentrified or people have moved to the southeastern part of Brooklyn, it's still known for its rich African-American culture or rich Caribbean culture. So it comes down to geography, right? To take the community of interest argument, community and interest, but it must be within that particular geography. What interests are you going to rally around, if you will?
Okay, we do have lunch for everyone. So all of us having a great discussion and asking questions are standing in the way of lunch. But let's just take all remaining questions that have been stimulated, especially beginning with the gentleman with the beard, and then the mask, and then Carmel.
Thank you all. You mentioned the blurring of boundaries between categories, and I remember, I think the number of people who check more than one box increased significantly in differences, although pretty small compared to, I guess, pretty large. Do you predict or assess, I guess, how long that number be 30 and it will impact how we draw our line and how we even interpret the Federal Women's Rights Act, or make more difficult to create new districts before that? How would that more than one box that are right?
Very timely question, yes.
So I managed the role I heard and they were talking about it. In the recent few elections, we have observed that some tiny concentrated districts are turning red. So I'm wondering whether there's any demographic change that can or that can tell us whether this is a long-term change or this is just a short-term like pattern.
Another fabulous question. I think you should get a PhD student at the Graduate Center to write a dissertation about that. It's a perfect question for an extended study. But yes. Was there another? You do have a question.
No, I don't.
You don't. Most unlike our students, they always have questions. So I think more people will choose multiple races. And then I think in the 2030 census, there's a very good chance that the Latino category will be made into a race. So right now, a lot of Latinos don't like to be either white or black or Asian, and they pick other race. It's almost become its own race in the category system. So all those others will turn into Latinos, but since we do want to know the racial makeup of Latinos, people will be encouraged, well, are you a black Latino, or what kind of Latino? Are you just a Latino or what? So just from that source alone, there'll be a lot more multiracials. And they've also added, when you're black or when you're Asian, they've added a category in the 100% sample questionnaire. Well, what kind are you? And they give some examples. So I think that's encouraged people to think in a more granular way about how they might identify and to pick everything that applies. So just the census data collection itself, I think, is going to encourage that. And it went from about 2% in 2000 to about 8% in 2020. And I think we can expect to see it sort of grow at the same rate. And it does make it blurry boundaries, and mixed communities does make it harder to draw districts if your goal is to recognize the concentrations of certain populations. And I've started to calculate a heterogeneity index of how mixed neighborhoods are. And certainly we have a lot of segregated neighborhoods that are 75 or 80% one racial group, but we're getting more and more mixed neighborhoods where nobody is a majority. And fairly stable patterns like that. It's not in the old days, demographers used to say, well, a mixed black-white neighborhood is just a white neighborhood where sooner or later all the whites will leave and it'll become a majority black neighborhood. That's not happening. You look at Bedford-Stuyvesant, less than 50% of the people are African-American that live there. I think it will continue to be a predominantly African-American neighborhood for a long time, but it's going to be a much more mixed neighborhood than it was in 1980, let's say. And we see mixtures of Asian and Latino groups. You walk down Roosevelt Avenue and the word for shoe store, well, they don't have any, it's Zapata or whatever it is in Korean or Chinese. And sometimes the store will have all those languages right on its front. So you're not going to unsort those communities. They're going to be mixed communities. So we have to think about not just what is an ethnically distinctive community, but what are our very mixed communities and what are the mixtures and how are people getting along and how will they express their feelings of commonality in a very diverse setting. Sociologists have started to talk about hyperdiversity, and New York has always been hyperdiverse. And so we tend to, look down our noses at Europeans who have realized there's more than one kind of minority immigrant group that may be living in their cities, but it is something sort of qualitatively new. I don't think there's another city on the planet, Los Angeles might disagree, where there's so many people from so many different origins who are all living together with no group being a dominant majority in the population or in the voting age population. It's a very interesting and new in history, that we have a democratic society that's hyper diverse. And it's true of Los Angeles and it's true of Chicago, and it's increasingly true even of places like Atlanta or Houston that we we thought of as sort of older southern city type. So it's a political, and it'll just make John's job that much more interesting in 2033 when he's running the next districting commission. And as far as Chinese Republicans go, I often get in trouble with my Democratic friends, and I consider myself a die-in-the-wool Democrat, by saying that New York City would benefit from a more competitive two-party system. And that the Republicans, I mean, if there's a finding in political science, it is that competition is necessary for democracy to work. One-party systems bring with them lots of problems. But we don't have a Republican Party in New York City that seems to want to be a competitive party. And it's certainly hurt by the national Republicans who have taken such a negative attitude towards immigrants and people who are not white, and it's catering to the sort of reactionary white base. Because a lot of the immigrant groups are culturally conservative and oriented towards small business. They don't like taxes, they don't like regulation. And if the Republican Party had its head screwed on right, they would be running candidates from immigrant backgrounds. They would be the immigrant success party, not the Democrats stole the election and Donald Trump should be president party. And I would also say that the spike in crime, in street crime that took place during the pandemic, granted, you have to see it in historical perspective, and the crime levels are still very, very much lower than they were in the early 1990s. Nothing like what it was back then. But, you know, the disarray on the streets, the lack of successful policing, disorder, it was very disturbing to not just Chinese communities, but a lot of, you know, a lot of working class communities with and the small business, you know, districts that are hearts of those communities. It was a problematic period, and you know, I don't think Democrats, and here I'm just speaking personally, I'm not representing anybody, but I don't think the Democrats candidates in the city did a good job of saying how they're going to improve the sense of security and order in neighborhood contexts in New York City in the last election. And I'm probably somewhat sympathetic to people who say there's been a lot of over-policing and police violence that's unwarranted, and we asked the police to do a lot of things that social service agencies could probably do better. But I think defund the police was about the stupidest, don't quote me, I'm gonna get in trouble with all my friends. Good luck with that, exactly. It was a dumb move, especially in the context of where we weren't able to offer an alternative that showed how it could be done in a community-oriented, social democratic, politically participatory way. So I think that accounted for the shift, both not just in the Chinese community, but also, I mean, Dominicans shifted notably towards Trump between 2016 and 2020 in New York City. And you would think, well, that's strange because Donald Trump doesn't particularly like the Dominican Republic. But I think it's for very similar reasons. Is it permanent? I think it's a challenge to the Democratic Party to understand and respond to the interests of all the working class communities in New York City. And I think Mayor Adams' election in 2020 was, I mean, that's basically what he ran on, and was an important reason for his very narrow victory in the election. He only won that election by, you know, what in the grand scheme of things is a mere handful of votes. And it'll be very interesting to see next time around what kind